Okay, I'll start, and hopefully, as I'm introducing Hugh, we might find others joining in onto Teams for this seminar. So, welcome everyone. It is now afternoon, so good afternoon to you all if you're in the UK, and welcome to one in our series of seminars we're giving for DigitLab. Today we've got Hugh Williamson, and he has been with us, I think, for 2 years. Is that right, Hugh?
Coming up to that.
Working with Professor Sarah Hartley on one of our key and important themes on responsible innovation with digital technologies or for digital transformation. Hugh is an anthropologist by training, quite a rare breed, particularly in our area of work. And has been trained in some venerable places like Durham and Cambridge. He specialises in work around sort of science and technology, and unfortunately, he's leaving us and going to a beautiful part of the world, Munich, to be a research fellow at the Technical University. Today's talk will be around Hugh's work with Sarah on responsible innovation, particularly in relation to the agri-tech industry. I don't want to say any more because obviously I'll be stealing Hugh's thunder in terms of the theme and findings and implications of the work. So without wasting any more of Hugh's time, I will hand over to Hugh.
That's great. Thanks, Leroy. That was a wonderful little intro there. Really set things up nicely for what I'm going to talk about. So let me just share my slides. And if I just double check, Leroy, can you give me a yes that is visible?
Yes, it is visible.
Brilliant. Okay, well, I'll get straight into it. So what I'm going to talk about today is a little bit about responsible innovation and what it is and how it's done, particularly in relation to digital transformation, which is one of the major themes of DigitLab as a centre. And I'm going to do that by talking through some of the work that Sarah and I have been doing in relation to animal agriculture and technology and data in that area. So broad overview, I'll give a little bit of quick background to the research projects on which Leroy's already touched on, then a bit of an introduction to responsible research and innovation, and then thinking about the case of animal agriculture as an example of doing RRI, responsible research and innovations, it's often called, in relation to digital transformations, going through a few stages of research that we've done as a gradual process, and then draw out a few little conclusions at the end. So as Leroy said, I'm part of DigitLab, where Sarah and I are working on the responsible research and innovation strand. Sarah's the lead, I'm the postdoc on this one, and we've been working on it for a little over a year and a half now, I guess, working on a few different LinkedIn projects which are focused on animal farming. And so responsible research and innovation, some of you may be familiar with it, some of you might not. There are quite a few definitions of what exactly it is, but as a very broad definition, it's an approach to research and development, whether that's in the academy or whether it's in industry. But it's an approach that seeks to shape both science and technology for the public good, for societal good, in response to a range of diverse voices and expertise, perhaps beyond the usual suspects, and also in a way that is mindful of the future impacts of science and technology, what they're likely to do to different areas of our world, the kind of impacts they might have, and the kind of futures that they might produce, and whether or not they're things that we want, whether they can be shaped in different ways. And most of the time, responsible research and innovation is driven by the social sciences. Could be a range of different social sciences. I'm an anthropologist by training. Other people have training such as political science, as Sarah does. But but there's usually some sort of social science element in there methodologically to engage society and stakeholders. And when we talk about responsibility in RRI, this is not just a question of doing kind of risk assessment or just doing a tick box of, okay, what are the ethical issues that might come up and have we addressed them? It's about much more than that. It's about engaging the different values that the public might have, that stakeholders might have, and the different visions that they might have for the future, and thinking about how tech and science can really be shaped towards and serve those different visions, and also how we can come across perhaps some of the differences in values and visions that people might have, and how we produce a degree of dialogue around that. And there's been some degree of formal adoption of RRI as principles. So you see that in research funders, UKRI and EPSRC in particular have RRI principles that they uphold, the same in European Union's Horizon 2020 scheme. And at a practical level, you might be familiar with some approaches to it. So co-production or co-design of technology with stakeholders is now quite well known. And as I'll show, that's one aspect of what we include in RRI. And there are a few different ways of passing out the main principles of it. Some of you might be familiar with the area framework that's adopted by UKRI. So that's to anticipate, reflect, engage, and act. My personal favorite in terms of the principles is the very similarly named AIR framework, which stresses that the major principles for doing responsible innovation, responsible research are firstly anticipation, so of risks, but also of all of the diverse changes that might come from introducing new tech or new scientific developments. Inclusion, so being very inclusive of voices beyond those who are usually directly involved in tech development, for example. So bringing the public in, bringing more marginal stakeholders in, and making sure their voices are heard. Reflexivity on the part of scientists and developers about what they're doing, why they're doing it, what they're committed to, what some of the assumptions are behind what they're doing. And also being responsive. So being responsive to any issues that might arise in the process, whether unanticipated or through discussions with diverse stakeholders, being able to hear what they're saying and then shape things in relation to that. And so thinking about the case here, so digital transformation can be a lot of different things. It might involve digitizing paper archives. It might involve introduction of new digital tech. Colleagues in Digit have been doing a wide range of work on what that might mean and how it might be facilitated in different settings. The one that we've been thinking about is animal agriculture. And so to give a little bit of background on digital transformation in animal farming in the UK, we've been thinking about digital livestock technologies initially. So this is an area of kind of devices and things, often automation. It might be robotic milkers. It might be sensing devices on animals, GPS collars, things like that. And these are just beginning to be addressed in policy debates. So there was recently this report that started last year, Moving On Up, thinking about how tech could be used to improve productivity in animal farming. And that was taken up and publicised by the NFU and some of the all-party parliamentary groups in government. But it's still at early days, and there's not much discussion about what this tech should be doing, what the ultimate uses of it are going to be, how it might change farming. And practically, there's been quite variable adoption on farms and by industry. Some areas use it a lot, some areas don't use it very much at all. But why is this important as a case study? So as something to think through in terms of responsible innovation and digital transformation beyond just the specifics of that sector? Well, I think it's a good example because animal farming has broad implications for a lot of stakeholders across both farming itself, so the farmers who are involved in it, but also society. And we can see this in all the debates about the environmental impact, whether meat eating is a good thing. And so that draws in a lot of different people and also implications for animals and, as I said, for the environment. So it's got a lot of impact potentially. And so it's worth thinking about where we might go with it and what we want as a society out of it. Also, it's an interesting case because it's highly challenge-led at the moment, particularly in terms of the R&D side and the funding. And I will get into that in a second as to why that's particularly important. So the background to the first project that we started undertaking here, which was to think about digital livestock tech as they're being developed for agricultural challenges, was some things that we know from the literature across the areas of the social science that look at science and technology. And one aspect of this is, more broadly, there's been a shift towards challenge-driven research and development. So responding to things like net zero, to issues of global hunger, all these kind of major high-level challenges that face us both nationally and globally. And driving R&D in relation to challenges can provide real opportunities for effectively and collectively responding to these problems, but it can also raise some issues, sociologically speaking, about who is driving the definition of challenges and who decides what's important and how it should be responded to. So that's a kind of an open question there. And then at the same time, we also know that agricultural technologies are often very contested. We know this from things like genetic modification, the biotech side, and that there are often very diverse views grounded in different approaches and values. So what we wanted to do was really to understand, in the first place, the diversity of different stakeholders' hopes and concerns about the use of digital technologies in animal farming, and use that as a way to begin to foster introduction of a wide range of values into the development and governance policy areas around new tech in animal farming. And so the way that we decided to go about this was to use a methodology known as anticipatory focus groups, which are setting up focus groups in a certain way that you include a range of stakeholders, but also try to engage them about topics that they may not necessarily have well-formed opinions about, because they might not necessarily be well developed themselves in relation to technologies. It might be early stage technologies. And also there may be areas that just haven't necessarily become sites of public interest because they're not yet controversial, for example. So we conducted a set of focus groups. We ran 5 with a range of primarily expert stakeholders. So not lay people in this case, but stakeholders from across the board. So we had some people involved in providing various services in agriculture. We had digital technology developers who've been working in the area. We had a range of farmers. So on the one hand, mainstream commercial farmers, and on the other hand, we also had some organic and regenerative farmers, so working at the other end of the scale, and then also animal welfare experts that spanned from academics working in that space through some of the NGOs who are involved in governance and regulation of animal welfare, through to some social scientists who've been involved in critically assessing animal welfare and well-being. And we used 3 case studies to engage their discussion on these topics. And these were examples of challenge-led digital technologies that we used as starting points to reflect a range of different examples of tech and of the kinds of challenges that were motivating them. So these case studies were, in the first case, it was the use of an X-ray CT scanner, which has been used for quite a while in the sheep sector to scan sheep for effectively for their meat outputs while they're still alive, so that sheep can be bred with more meat, but have recently been repurposed to look at different traits, and in this case specifically to analyze the size of sheep's rumens, their guts, and link that potentially to the amount of methane that they emit, and potentially then breed sheep with lower methane emissions. So that was an example responding to a net zero challenge. It's also an example of a technology that's quite inaccessible in some ways because it's very, very large. It requires a lot of preparation. You've got to bring animals to it. Second case was researchers who are developing a 3D camera early warning system, which is responding to some issues around tail biting in pigs in intensive systems, where because they're penned up quite tightly, there are often behavioral issues because they can't take their natural behaviors. And so they'll start biting each other's tails, which has issues both for the animal's welfare and for the ultimate productivity of the sector, because it can lead to infections and discarding of meat. So in this case, they were using 3D cameras to try and find behavioral markers of when tail biting might start, so that alerts could be sent to farmers and then the farmers could intervene. That's an example of a smaller kind of tech that can be fitted directly on farm and is responding to animal welfare and to challenges of productivity and efficiency. And then the third case was looking at how data is being collected from across the whole supply chain for animal farming and how that was being integrated into some large databases for livestock breeding. And so this was to make large data resources available that could be used in a number of different directions, but primarily in terms of improving animal breeding to be more effective, more efficient, and faster at achieving certain kinds of goals in response to industry needs. So we showed those cases to the different focus groups and talked through them, how they evaluated them, what degree of support they had for them, and then analysed that to think about what the major approaches that they took to these issues were. And one of the key things that came out of this was that there were three major areas of consideration that different stakeholders raised. These were the purpose of the technology, so what was driving it, why it was being developed, what challenge it was responding to, the practicality of the technology. So this is how easy is it to develop, how easy is it to install on farm, how easy is it for farmers to adopt it. And this is again the area that you would mostly get in relation to adoption of new tech. And then finally, what are the effects? So again, this is some of the areas where you would most expect social scientists to be involved. Think about how does it affect animals? How does it affect people, environments, farming systems? And so these three areas came out quite clearly, but they weren't evenly distributed across all of the different groups. So some groups were much more concerned around purpose, ultimately, particularly the animal welfare groups and the organic regenerative farming groups. Whereas for others who were maybe already involved with a lot of tech development, mainstream farmers, they were very concerned about the practicality because they took the purpose as already fitting with what they wanted. And so that really highlighted for us that while a lot of the tech development at the moment was responding to the needs of certain groups, there were other groups, particularly those working in alternative farming systems, for whom it wasn't really addressing in the same way. And so one of the things that we drew out from this was a set of questions. In some ways, these are really heuristic rather than a strict framework, but questions that could be asked by policymakers, by researchers, by tech developers to think about whether or not they've addressed the concerns and the needs of different stakeholder groups when they're in the process of developing things. So on the purpose side, they can ask sort of why is the driving and challenge important and for whom? And will the technology actually solve that challenge in particular kinds of farms? On the practicality side, does it actually work? Can it be installed on farm? And then the effect side, are they thinking about all the potential people and other beings, whether it's animals, whether it's the environment, who might be affected there? And so this is something that we really consider can be a complementary tool to existing tools, many of which have addressed the practicality and the effect side. So on the practicality side, methods of co-designing technologies with stakeholders to find out and make sure whether they fit with their needs, or doing sort of early ethical assessments to work out the effects. But there are less tools out there for thinking about purpose and bringing purpose in as a point of reflection when we are thinking about developing new technology. So we wanted to give a bit of a lens in there. And so if that was an approach for engaging people on the policy and development side, we also wanted to expand these findings out a little bit. So we've been doing some public engagement work here, and we're in the process of developing a short documentary film called Digital Animals, which takes some of the case studies from that research and presents them in ways that are quite understandable to a public audience to begin to develop some of the dialogue and public discussion that, as I indicated at the start, is maybe missing at the moment in policy debates around what kinds of technology should be developed, whether these serve different kinds of farming, and whether they're the right kinds of farming that we want. And so that is coming out in the next month or so. We're just putting it through the final stages at the moment. We will be showing that at the British Science Festival in early September, which is being held in East London this year. And so from that research, there were also a couple of loose threads that we noticed that we thought were worth following up on in terms of really making sure that we addressed some of the potential impacts of technologies and brought that inclusive element in. And one of these was the fact that, in particular, the organic and regenerative farmers, who we're characterizing here as broadly agroecological, because that's a nice umbrella term, they didn't really see any digital technologies that are on the market at the moment responding to their needs. So we wanted to think about, okay, well, how would we change that situation? What exactly do they want? Is it a question of just there are new devices that need to be made for their needs, or is there something more that needs to go on there? And then the second case that was really important was that the third out of the three cases that we had, with the scanner, the 3D camera, and the use of data, it was very clear that while there were some mixed opinions about the first two cases, the first one in particular with the CT scanning and breeding for lower methane emissions wasn't particularly popular. The second case was seen as potentially useful in some conditions. The data question was one that was really seen as very open. Almost everyone across the stakeholder group saw it as potentially important, but they didn't really know where it was going to go at the moment, what the data that's being collected in the livestock space could be used for, who it would ultimately benefit. There were potential uses, but the future was uncertain there. And so we thought we'd explore that one too. So I'll go through these two areas in turn before wrapping up. So in terms of thinking about digital technology for agroecology, the way we approached this was less as a research project and more as a collaborative approach. So we held a workshop in Exeter back in April, which we organised together with an NGO who have been quite active in the agricultural space, a bigger conversation. And they've been mostly working before on issues around biotech, genetic modification, and trying to bring together the many different voices on that, which has often been quite a conflicted area, to get some kind of wider societal discussion around whether those are things we want or not. And they recently have shifted into thinking about technology more broadly and had published this report that the final version has just come out, thinking about what exactly agroecological farmers want when they're choosing technology and how that fits with their broader set of social and cultural values, and their approach to farming as something that's not just a kind of a practical stick your hoe in the ground sort of thing, but involves lots of relationships and systems of mutual support and learning. And so together with our colleagues Pat Thomas and Lawrence Woodward from Big Conversation, we ran this workshop that was inclusive of social scientists, but also a range of farmers in the agroecology space, some computer scientists from Exeter, and funders. So we had both people from Devon County Council who've been involved in their agritech funding and representatives from Innovate UK there, and also some larger farms such as Riverford, as well as smaller farmers and representatives of the NFU. So a nice broad range of people there. And the aim with that was to address a set of questions that we had set up in advance and also discussed with the workshop participants, which was really thinking about changing the perspective on what digital technology development is, because it's often presented as something about developers identify a need existing out in the market, then they develop a tool and then put it on the market, and it can potentially resolve the issues there. But it was clear that that wasn't really working in the agroecology space. So what we wanted to know was what exactly success meant for introducing new tech, and particularly digital tech, into agroecological farming. Because these are farmers who are often, they're doing it for a range of other values than just commercial production. It might be environmental values and biodiversity. It might be for producing food within local context. And success isn't necessarily just in plugging a device in there. It's about linking up with their wider social networks, for example. So we took that question of success and then thought about, okay, what are the social aspects that are necessary for success then? What kind of networks and collaborations have produced successful technologies so far? And then thinking about how might we steer technology development towards agroecology without it being just a sort of a service provision kind of approach. How could we actually interface between working farmers who have their own sets of values, and then also digital tech developers who have certain kinds of expertise and may be able to respond if it's seen as a kind of a gradually developed consensual kind of approach. And so one of the final questions that we had around that was also, what can agroecology contribute to digital technology? Again, this turning the perspective. And agroecological farming is an interesting area because it's often done on smaller scales through collaborations between many different actors. It's often quite slow in the way it progresses. And so we addressed some questions of whether maybe there are models there for how we also do tech development at the same time, and whether we can perhaps move away from models where it's just kind of tech development top down, as I say, providing certain things in response to needs without necessarily doing the slower work of seeing how it fits into, in this case, farming environments. And so there's a report that we're just pulling together from that at the moment, and then we'll be sharing that back with the participants, including Innovate in particular, and hopefully we'll be able to move forward there with potentially developing both some new funding opportunities for that area, but also producing some new models for how funding and development could be done in that space with that kind of the small scale, the slower, the collaborative model. And then on the second loose thread that I mentioned, the question of governing or the question of data in livestock farming and where it's going, we noticed after looking into this more that there was very little attention yet to any sort of data governance around the animal farming space by either academics or people in industry. There are a range of people who are involved in collecting data from sort of farm software and farm device producers through to larger database holders, for example, by some of the industry bodies, the levy body AHDB, if people are familiar with those. And they have their own sort of internal data governance policies, but there's no real wider level discussion, particularly from government at the moment, about how data should be produced, what it should be used for, how it should be linked up, and what the ultimate end goal of using it would be. So that was something that we thought was necessary to dig a bit deeper into in order to clarify some of the uncertainty that had come up when we were engaging with a range of different stakeholders in the focus groups. And we know that from previous work by social scientists, again, challenge-led research and development has been quite important here. So in the animal breeding space more broadly, and thinking about the use of genetics, so not necessarily what we would think about of as digital transformation or digital technology here, but with some overlaps, there has been a push towards using animal breeding as a way of responding to things like sustainability challenges. So the first case study from our focus groups regarding using the CT scanner to breed animals with lower methane emissions is a good example of that. What one commentator has called a molecularization of sustainability in relation to the genetics side there. And so we were wondering, if those are ongoing dynamics, what's the role of digitalization and data use in these processes? We wanted to dig into that a bit more to see whether they were continuing some of those directions, and then how they would fit with the different stakeholder views that we'd seen on this coming forward. So we took as a case study the area of sheep breeding. This one was quite an interesting one because we wanted to look at the ruminant animal sector more broadly, so that's sheep and cattle. Because they're very decentralized, there are a lot of stakeholders involved farming in different ways. This is very true of the sheep sector. But what's slightly different about the sheep sector compared to the cattle sector, for example, is that there is very limited data use at the moment in terms of collecting information about animals and then using that to breed them in particular. So it's at a very, very early stage. It could go in a lot of different directions. But one of the things that is notable there is that all animals, all sheep must have electronic ID tags, which can be scanned. And that's quite an efficient way of collecting data about them. So there's a possibility of doing something more there. And as we've seen, there's a big push to respond to some of the challenges that are approaching the farming sector more broadly, such as net zero. And you can see in the bottom, I've got an example of that project there, Breed for Change, which is a wider consortium of industry and academia thinking about breeding low methane sheep that's received quite a bit of funding from Innovate UK. And so the research questions for thinking about this little mini project were quite basic ones, really, again, addressing those questions of governance and stakeholder vision. So we think about how are data and digitalization being integrated into this sector to start with, because there wasn't much clarity around that. And then how is that data being governed currently? And then second from that, what are the different visions for data use and data governance in the sector at the moment? So distributed between the different actors, whether it's different kinds of farmers, hill farmers up on the top of a mountain in Wales, or larger scale lowland farmers who are producing a lot of meat to send to market. Same time, people involved with governing the rare breeds on the one hand, and then also DEFRA, of course, and some of the industry bodies where they see this going. And then thinking about how all those different views intersect with each other. Is the consensus? Is there some conflict? Is there much discussion at all? Or are they quite siloed off? And so methodologically with this, we used the focus group data from last year because two of the cases there directly addressed this, both the CT scanning case and the data, the breeding data case, which led into this research project. But then on top of that, I've been doing a range of interviews over the last few months. We're currently at 15 with primarily sheep breeders involved in data collection, providers of farm management software, some of the large database owners and managers, and academics to really understand the contours of the current sector at the moment as a way of understanding where things currently are and how that fits with what we know from the focus groups about stakeholders' views on this. I've also been looking at a range of grey literature on this, as we call it, so kind of the reports and guidelines and things that get produced in the sector for use by farmers, but are often quite an interesting lens onto what's going on and why. And so we've got a couple of initial results from this that we're going to be working on over the next few months in terms of analysing in a bit more detail and also starting to engage some of the major stakeholders involved here. So both at the policy level and the particular database owners at an industry level. And these are perhaps a little unsurprising relative to what we already knew from the focus groups, but they are useful for pinpointing in terms of what's necessary. So the first point is that there's very incremental digital transformation here. When we talk about digital transformation, often with Digit, the focus has been in particular on large established organizations where somebody can make an executive decision and then that will be implemented. But because in this case, it's a very diverse sector and much of farming is very diverse and decentralized with lots of different actors working independently, in this case, there hasn't been wide leadership over how data should be used and whether or not new systems should be put in place. Most of the use of data and the development of new technologies for data collection has been very incremental. It's sort of responsive, which is good in some ways. It's responding to the needs of different groups, but it's not necessarily responding to those different groups in coordinated ways. And as such, it's not very clear what the future shape of this system will be. It's gradually expanding. More people are being drawn into it. More data is being collected. But who's going to be participating in that, and also whether there will be actors beyond what is currently quite a small group of largely voluntary actors who are active in collecting data about their own farms. But then there are a lot of people who are not yet involved in that, and whether we'll get more automation coming through and who would then be involved in owning or using that data. It's very unclear. And that is something that needs to be addressed at a wider policy and industry level. And so the second point is that there are really a lot of different visions for how the data itself can be used in breeding. So in terms of governing animal farming, sort of the numbers of animals that are out on certain environments, that's a big concern, particularly in relation to environmental policy and subsidies. Also, the actual animals themselves and how they're being changed through new data collection, whether it is breeding animals using data about their methane emissions, for example, to produce low methane, low greenhouse gas emission animals, or whether it's producing productivity. And all of these different visions of how the data could be used are driving certain aspects of data collection, but they're not necessarily complementary. And in some cases, they might be in direct tension. So you might have different groups invested in different things, or you might, in fact, have farmers who are facing kind of competing tensions as they themselves are trying to work out how to engage with this. And it's also the case that many of the stakeholders here don't really see the benefits as being evenly distributed. And so this situation leaves one where it's clear there's a lack of coordination overall, and that more people need to be brought into an open discussion around this. So that's a kind of a next stage for what we're doing, is engaging some of the higher level actors around that. And so, having just done a bit of a whistle-stop tour through what we've been doing over this project, I want to just conclude with a few thoughts of what actually this shows for those of you who might be interested in responsible innovation in relation to something like digital transformation. You may or may not be interested in animal farming, but I think what we can see from the way we've approached this is that when you're doing responsible innovation, it's not just something that can be fully formalized as a tick box exercise. Say, okay, we're going to speak to this number of people, and then we're going to deal with what they say, and then we'll just incorporate that in how we're developing new technology or how we're going to roll out this technology. It's a very iterative process that involves quite a lot of back and forth. It requires following different areas of concern, as we did. So we started off with the focus groups where we spoke to a few different stakeholders, and we saw some threads opening up from there of areas that perhaps needed more attention. And then following those different threads of values and interests and concerns across different forums. So following it up with, as I've been doing with the interviews with the people involved in data collection and data governance, and in the agroecology case, taking that into collective forums where there can be discussion between funders and between farmers and social scientists. So these are all ways of building up gradually over a process of opening up, sort of identifying the key areas and then opening that up in different areas to different voices and thinking about how we might take that forward, and producing tools that people can use, such as the table on purpose, practicality and effects that I showed earlier. And I think one of the other things that's very clear from this research is that thinking critically about the purposes of digital transformation and who that's responding to is vital, because it came up again and again within the research that you have to think about whether purpose is responding to the wider stakeholders who might be out there and might be affected by any transformation. And this is particularly so in a period where there are very challenge-led approaches to R&D policy that might set certain challenges, such as net zero, up as this is something we need to respond to. But the urgency around those can sometimes lead to a bit of an erasure of some of the nuances and dynamics of who's involved. Is this the right solution for these people, and so on? And moreover, I think one of the final conclusions is that there are multiple ways of doing responsible innovation. It's not just one approach. There are some ways that are perhaps better known, so co-design of technologies with stakeholders, but there are also others. They may be more formalized, such as early ethical assessment, or they may be more open-ended, such as the anticipatory focus groups that we've used. And that's something worth bearing in mind if you are interested in using responsible innovation in your own work, that there are a lot of different ways of going about it, and that you can set things up in quite a flexible way depending on your needs and depending on what appears in the area. And so I will conclude there, and we can shift to any questions that people might have. So I'll just thank directly Sarah Hartley, who has been involved as much as I have with all of this work and has been guiding it with a very clear and firm hand, and then also to some of our collaborators, Tom Law, who is involved with the film, and then Pat and Lawrence, who organised the agroecology workshop with us.
Thank you, Hugh. That was excellent. I wonder if you can stop sharing, and then we can open this up for comments and questions. I mean, I just want to kind of summarize, in my mind, one really lovely contribution about your talk, and that it's an example of a kind of socio-technical study. And I imagine most people in the room, most people on teams, are probably from a very technical background, and it's often very it's not often that they would hear the sort of world they inhabit being described with a very much a kind of sociological or anthropological voice. And I thought you brought together that kind of the socio-tech issues really well in both your introduction and through the examples. So you should be applauded for that. Anyway, are there anybody who would like to kick off with a question or a comment? Well, maybe I'll kick off with one, and then hopefully we'll get people warmed up to engage with some of your work. One of the main messages coming through is this idea to focus on purpose, and I thought that was a really good theme to sort of bring out in terms of your work. But one of the challenges around that is that obviously different people are thinking about the same thing will have different purposes. I was really intrigued with one of the case studies around, I think it was methane and net zero. And I thought that amplified for me the issue of sort of multiple purposes colliding that might lead to a sort of an orientation imbalance. What do you prioritize the most? If we focus on net zero, you move away from the sort of the purpose of sheep farming. If you focus too much on methane reduction, what else would that mean that someone have to, or one stakeholder would have to give up in relation to their purpose? So I was wondering, in terms of the study, how much did you consider the sorts of tensions and contradictions of purposes as you were sort of drawing out, the stakeholders' understanding of sort of being responsible with regards to their innovation?
Thanks, Leroy. That's a really good question. And the point about the tensions involved here is it's absolutely central. It's one of the things that really came out very clearly is that there's no situation where you just have these clearly defined purposes and that they're siloed off. One person has one purpose, one person has another, and that there's then some sort of, I don't know, direct conflict between them, and that a lot of people are grappling with these issues. And in terms of the methane example, that's a really interesting one. That when we were initially discussing with the focus groups that case study, there was a relatively clear split between what people thought about that. And it was only really the people already involved with animal breeding who thought that breeding sheep directly for less methane was a good idea.
Yeah.
A lot of the other farmers thought, well, maybe you just need to increase the efficiency. So, for example, if you're sending lambs off to an abattoir, do that at a younger age. So get them to the right weight earlier, and then that will reduce the overall efficiency of the sector. And then other people saying, well, actually, the main issue is just the number of animals out on the landscape to start with. And we need to have a rethink of the scale of farming with animals more broadly. So there were quite different views there that mostly linked to the kind of jobs that people had in the sector, whether they were already a sheep farmer or whether they were somebody who was working in a much more small scale farming or an animal welfare background. But then since getting into the discussion of the data side over the last few months, it's become very clear that even the farmers who are participating directly in those breeding projects are facing quite a few tensions in that there is less funding for them to undertake research and animal breeding around the kind of things that they would typically have done. So the kind of the more productivity focused things, but there are now these drivers for responding to net zero coming from groups like Innovate on down. And so that creates new incentives to produce these projects that do some of this work, but they engage with them because they do still get some benefits. That's where they get the funding coming down that can be used for other things like other kinds of data collection that they wouldn't otherwise be able to do. So they might be relatively ambivalent about it, but they're caught in these situations where they don't necessarily have much choice. So there is that kind of split between what are the policy and funding drivers, and while they might respond to wider perceptions of what the issue is, whether or not the thing that gets funded does fit with both the interests of the people who are actually engaged in it or the other stakeholders around it, is this open question that hasn't really been addressed properly. So again, that area of tension is something that really needs to be brought out more and addressed directly, I think.
I think it's vital to tease out the tensions and the sticky points. But I think one of the things you said in your response is that there's almost a dependency on resources that also amplify the tension. So you speak of farmers or those set of stakeholders that are looking for opportunities for funding, and that might be driving their thinking with regards to how they might orientate their sort of priorities. Right. I don't want this to be just a discussion between me and Hugh, so I'd really love anyone else who would like to kind of join in the conversation to either offer a question on in the chat or stick their hands up and show your face and let us hear your voice. So Sarah's just asking, Sarah Hartley, how does our RRI research compare to those of other centres? Sarah, are you presuming other centres outside Exeter, so outside Digit, or I think we can all chip in with this, particularly those who are at the recent showcase. It was interesting to hear how the other digital transformation centres were thinking about responsibility and ethics. And I think each had their own particular flavour and emphasis. So Decade, for example, I was really intrigued with, really focused on the idea of provenance of data and the sorts of risk associated with provenance and the kinds of issues and tensions that might arise, which I think help to sort of think through what the issues might be in regards to responsibilization and responsible innovation. Again, I really don't want this just to be me talking. Anyone else want to speak up? There's a hand. I can't see who it is. It is Angela.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, thank you. I was just about to write it in the chat and I thought, no, I'll be big and brave and I'll speak up. So I lead the project management degree apprenticeship for the university, and one of the reasons I signed up for this is because I was really interested to see how the sustainability and the social elements of the research projects that you're doing might then have some learnings that we could take maybe in as new research into our apprentices that are studying project management. And I've not been disappointed. So I think there's some really great crossovers here, and I suppose I've not had any engagement with research projects up to now. Been far too busy getting the programme up and running and finding lecturers and all that good stuff. But what I'd be really interested in is how do we bring this research maybe in quite a personal way, by maybe one of you guys from the team maybe coming to talk to our apprentices about, because what we're trying to get them to think about is social elements of their projects, sustainability elements of their projects. And although this wouldn't necessarily be within the industry that they're in, I think in some respects it makes it more interesting because it makes them focus on more the social and sustainable elements. And that's something that we're trying to bed into our programmes as much as possible. Going forward for their year 2 studies, they've got stakeholder engagement and communication management, for example, and they've got organisational change management, which is looking after the people elements of stuff. So I'd be really interested, and maybe it's an offline conversation, but I just thought I'd come on and say, really, really interested in what you're saying. There's so many great principles that you're highlighting here that are absolutely marry up with the syllabus of our programme. And I think there's a great opportunity here to spread the word and to get some, real live research in front of some of our apprentices to help them really get the essence of the University of Exeter, because they're in the workplace 4 days a week. So I don't know. Thoughts?
Can I quickly respond, and then Hugh, because there's one thing you said I thought was really interesting about the agri industry, and this may be something that they're not used to hearing about. One thing I could say is the agri industry is so rich and so interesting that, as an alternative to think about with regards to sort of the theories and ideas that the students might be engaging with, it'd be a fascinating industry just to sort of focus on, to just bring out some of the real issues and difficulties that where they are in their own particular work they might face. So I just wanted to emphasize that it's a really interesting opportunity to just say, let's look at this alternative industry and then think about the problems and solutions that we have to do. But Hugh was about to respond.
Actually,
Sorry.
No, Leroy, I was just about to say, actually, in having said that, it doesn't actually, one of our clients is Amazon, and
Right.
one of its business lines is Amazon Fresh, which is it's about having stores with obviously food in it. So actually it is part of their supply chain, so it's so actually I think, I'm starting to think a bit more openly now about it, and I think it sounds, and getting far too excited. So
yeah, but Angela, I would be more than happy to get involved. That either Sarah or I could definitely do something there. I mean, both of us have been involved with similar kinds of things before. One that I did recently and Sarah's done for several years is working with iGEMS, which is an undergrad competition for synthetic biology. So the students are tasked to produce some kind of synthetic biology kind of output, almost like a biotech development thing. And they are charged also with engaging with some of these responsible innovation ideas too. So we kind of talk through with them what that might mean, how they might go about it, and then they have to actually put that into practice when they're doing it. So it's similar kind of situation. And be very happy to talk to some of the people on the apprenticeship scheme.
Thank you. That'd be great. I will be in touch.
Yes, yeah.
Thank you, Angela. Anybody else with any comments, thoughts, any provocations that might be in the room or potentially to share? If you're typing, I have to wait until you finish. I can see someone's trying to type. No, maybe not. Okay, well, it was a Sarah. All right. Well, look. Again, I'm really grateful to Hugh for giving us a real tour of the sort of background and detail of the work. I do feel that it is one of the most important strands in terms of Digitlab's research is to focus on responsible innovation. I think the setting is absolutely rich and exciting in terms of the agri industry. I think the tensions around digital transformation and sustainability, which is really coming through in all of the case studies that Hugh's provided, would be an invaluable and fertile area to sort of explore and expand, particularly for the scholars or the theorists within Digitlab. And then the one thing I wondered, Hugh, and maybe Sarah could jump in as well, is the data seems also amenable to other things that other people are doing within Digitlab. So I'm thinking of Dimitris and I are really interested in this idea of mobilizing data. The idea that actually data is a resource and it's a challenge for stakeholders to recognize its value, and I was thinking about and reflecting on the last study that you described, and particularly its focus on data, and wondered whether a lens to maybe kind of bring into view some issues around those tensions might be to think of the data as a resource. So perhaps we could have a conversation about that at some point.
Yeah, definitely. The value of data is something that's been coming up a lot in those conversations with people in the sheep sector. Yeah.
Yeah, just Leroy, I think that's a really good point. And we're really kind of developing those ideas that you presented at the end. So it's a good time for us to chat that through with you.
Brilliant. I'd be happy to. Fantastic. Okay. Right. If Mike's just given you a big clap, and Angela, you seem to have a lot of people interested in chatting to you, so that's a good outcome. If there are no more questions, no more comments, and you're fed up of seeing Hugh's face, I will call this seminar to a close. So again, Hugh, Sarah, and all your team, thank you for a really, really good description of some excellent research. Really, really appreciate it. So thank you very much.
Thank you for the invitation too. Been great to chat.
Yeah, and good luck in Munich.
Thanks.
Yeah, stay off those beers and cakes. Okay, bye.
Bye, everyone.